Kobe Bryant is a five-time NBA champion. He's considered one of the top 10 players of all time by most experts and analysts. Some people even have him as elevated as their top five. I mean, Charles Barkley was notably one of them. Throughout his whole career, he was always contrasted against Michael Jordan, not just because Michael Jordan is generally considered the consensus number one player of all time, but they're also both shooting guards. Because he came after Michael Jordan, he clearly patterned a lot of his game on Michael Jordan, and crucially, they were both shooting guards who were the star hard carry of some of their teams, NBA champions, MVPs, etc., and were considered the best player in the league. So there's clearly a model there, because before Michael Jordan, it was rare that the best player on a team was a shooting guard and was a top scorer and still a champion and the best player in the league. That's actually a famous thing that Michael Jordan was able to overcome, and a stereotype a stigma he was able to shed and to break by being a scoring champion, but also the best player in the league and having the best player be a shooting guard and not, for example, a center or a power forward or something of that sort. Perhaps I'll make a video on that one day in terms of how Michael Jordan changed the NBA in that respect. So the problem Kobe has always had is one of the knocks that you will always hear on him from critics goes along the lines that even though he won 5 NBA championships, really he only won 2 NBA championships. Or he won some number between 2 and 5, but depending on how harshly you want to judge him and how you want to make the case, it's not the same as he won 5 championships and Michael Jordan, for example, won 5 championships and LeBron has won 3 championships at the point of recording this video, etc. It's not that way. And so, because the implication is he played on a team with Shaq, and for his first 3 championships, Shaq was the best player on the team, so the story goes, and Shaq carried him, and Shaq was the one who won all the NBA Finals MVPs, and Shaq was an MVP player during that time, literally MVP, and arguably the best player in the NBA for a number of those years. And so, especially when contrasting Kobe against Michael Jordan, this argument will always be brought up. You'll have heard it many times before. It's been argued not very well on either side, but many, many times before in many comment sections. And obviously, not just against Michael Jordan before him and LeBron after him, but even back during this period of time when he won the first 3 championships, whenever people were bringing up him contrasted against the other great guards in the league. So against T-Mac, when T-Mac was on a shooting spree in 2003, 2004, against Allen Iverson, when he was an MVP level player, 2001, went to the finals, etc. People would say, well, yeah, Kobe's good, but if you put one of them on Shaq's team, they'd have all the titles as well, and he wouldn't have any titles. And so this was always the way it was contrasted against him. So the myth here is that Kobe's 3 first rings, so 3 of his 5, just come from being carried by Shaq. And that he was at best just the sidekick of Shaq, and that really it's about Shaq winning those titles. And ultimately, if we want to talk about the best players of all time, yes, we have to really look at the teams where they were like the alpha, where they were the number one focus, the number one option, especially if we want to contrast them against Michael Jordan, who clearly was the number one option at all points in his career where he was a great player. So yes, we do have to look at that. We have to look how did they win when they were the number one guy, the alpha dog, as it were. So yes, Michael Jordan has a great record in as much as he has 6 at that point in time, and no one can fuck with that. Now, some of the other ones, we have to start asking questions. But in Kobe's case, people always go harsh the other way. And they make it sound like he only has 2 titles. Some people are even so nuts that they look at some of the issues he had in Game 7 versus the Celtics in 2010. They imply that like Pau Gasol should have been the MVP of the finals that year, which is absolutely ludicrous. But haters are going to hate, right? So the problem is, that narrative that the first 3 rings are due to Shaq, Kobe was just carried by him, and Shaq was the best player by far, and he was at best the sidekick. That's the myth. Now, there are some reasons as to why that myth exists, and some factors that play into its favor. So, Shaq won all 3 of the finals MVPs for those 3 titles. Shaq was the MVP of the NBA and for the first title winning season, 1999-2000. Shaq had monster playoff games during these runs where he would have 40 plus points, he'd have 10, 15 rebounds, he was dominating. So yeah, you know what? There is some truth that spawns the myth. But the problem is the way it's presented, and that overall narrative is a myth. So let's look at it and let's break it down, because we'll start in the areas that are true and we'll work our way into the parts that are just nonsense when you look at it and you actually both quantitatively looking at the stats and qualitatively looking at the games and the impact, see it's nonsense. So in the early days, absolutely, those first couple of seasons, I mean, it's not even comparable. Yes, Kobe wasn't even a top 2, top 3 player on his teams in the first couple of seasons in the NBA. He was not even a sidekick at that point in time. He was just another player in a talented team. So for the 97 and 98 seasons, it was Shaq was a clear MVP level player. The other players were good, and some of them were like approaching all-star level, obviously got into some all-star games, but none of them close to Shaq's level, especially not in terms of impact or points. And Kobe was just a rookie coming into his own, learning the game. But it's the 1999 and the 2000 season, so the season before they win the title, before they get Phil Jackson, and then the season where they get Phil Jackson, they win the title. Yes, Kobe's a sidekick at this point in time. Like 1999, he averages less than 20 points per game. 2000 with Phil, he averages 21.1 points a game, but that's the season that Shaq's the MVP. Shaq's balling out of control. There's this famous story about Shaq kind of challenged him to play every minute of every game to get him in shape, citing his hero Will Chamberlain, saying that's something that he was able to do. And so Shaq was arguably his best year ever. And you go to the playoffs, yeah, there's some games in 1999 where Kobe shoots them out of the team. Like, yes, at this point in time, he's the sidekick. 1999 and 2000, he's the clear sidekick. He shoots them out some games in 1999. He's not ready. He's not ready to face the Spurs, especially. Shaq's the clear best player once you come to 2000, and already was anyway, but he's clear best player in 2000. He was an MVP level player throughout the playoff run and was dominant throughout the playoffs. And obviously in the finals, he was very dominant. And Kobe had some poor play in that final against the Pacers, barring a specific game that we'll reference later. So Kobe was the second best player, but even so, it's not as simple as that. There were games where Kobe was the best player or had extremely good games during that 2000 playoff run. So in the first round, they played the Kings, and the Kings were a rising team, and obviously in later years, the Kings would be a real threat to the Lakers. But this year, people forget this one in 2000, which is it was in the first round, and back then, the first round was a best of 5. It wasn't a best of 7. And actually, the Kings took the Lakers to a game 5. And in games 2 and games 3, so game 2 was a win for the Lakers and game 3 was a loss, Kobe was the best player, and he had some pretty good games at this point. Not monster games like he would have in the next seasons, but very good games, especially for a young player. I think he was like, what would you be at that point in time? 22, I think? 22, yeah, I think so. And he was the best player in the game for those ones. Then you go to the next round, the Suns. Now, he didn't have a good series. He had a lot of struggles in this series. He was going head-to-head with Petty, Shaq's old kind of sidekick, as it were, who was now playing for the Suns. They just got, I think did they have Jason Kidd at that point in time? Yeah, they must have still had. Yes, I think they did. I think he had the dyed hair even. But there was a game in this series, game 2, where Kobe, after having a terrible game, hit the game winner. That actually won them the game by a single point. Now, this ultimately didn't matter because they did win the series 4-1, but it could have been a lot closer because that was a road game for the Suns. So if they split 1-1 in the first 2 games and then they go back to their home, now the series can potentially get a lot tougher. It makes it harder to go deeper in the playoffs. Obviously, they needed all that stamina and energy for the 7-game series against the Trailblazers in the conference finals, which we'll get to now. Now, if you remember, coming into the conference finals, the storyline, the narrative went, the teams are too deep, as in the Portland Trailblazers had a stack of really good teams across all the starters and on the bench. They had defensive players, they had scorers, they had centers, they had perimeter players, they had small forwards, they had everything in that team. Very, very strong team. And then you go on, they had good coaching as well. And then you go over to the Lakers, and their story was too deep, as in two players that are really good, and then the rest of them are like decent, and no one's quite sure about some of them, and they've only just got Phil Jackson. So people already acknowledged Kobe was a potential star, but he was still blossoming into one at that point in time. Even so, in the Portland series, which ended up being a full 7-game series, most famously with that epic Game 7, the Kobe to Shaq pass, there were 3 games that Kobe had really good performances in. So particularly one that people forget is actually in the Game 6 loss, where they don't close the series out and they let it go to a 7th game when they'd been up 3-1. And in Game 6, Kobe had a fantastic individual game when the rest of the Lakers struggled. He made 6 3-pointers. He all around had a great game and was really trying when the rest of the Lakers looked like they'd been dispirited. They'd given up to some degree. Game 7, he had a fantastic game. He had 25 points, 11 rebounds, 7 assists, and 4 blocks. And if you look at what happened, yes, Portland had a meltdown at the end of the game, but Kobe was playing some lockdown defense. And then beyond that, he obviously made the key pass to Shaq, which won them the game and essentially was the backbreaker for the Lakers over the Trailblazers and sent them to the finals. Now, in the finals, yes, he played poorly against the Pacers, and the Pacers also were a fairly deep team. They weren't as top-heavy, but they were fairly deep. And I have to say, in general, he didn't do that well. He was still a very young guy, obviously, but he had a fantastic game there where he was the best player in the game, which was Game 4. Famously, this is the one where Shaq fouls out of the game towards the end. Kobe was actually on an injured foot because he'd been injured at the end, I think, of Game 2, at some point in Game 2, and then he had to miss all of Game 3. So in Game 4, he's back. He's on an injured foot, but he has a great game. He makes 14 field goals. He takes over at the end when Shaq fouls out, and he makes these 3 key jumpers. and wins them the game in what ended up being a 6-game series. So that could be dangerous if that gets to a 7th game. Now, he was poor in the finals, and that is an issue that would repeat and is a key issue to this discussion. Because if you only look at the finals, that's where a lot of people with their very large, big picture view of people's careers tend to judge them. Like, I mean, one of the things that blows my mind is some of the analysts on TV who judge players just by like how they did in the finals and like ignore the rest of their regular season, the playoff series they play, and act like it was just 1v1 you versus the other star in the final, which doesn't really work at all. Like, well, Michael Jordan won all 6, but you didn't play the same opponent, did he? But anyway, that's a side topic, as you can see. So now what we're going to do, there's 2000, where he was a sidekick. He'd come into his own, but he was a sidekick because Shaq was the best player in the NBA. Now, there's only one championship gone so far, so we'll give that one a Shaq. We'll say Kobe doesn't really get that one. But the problem is, now we're going to 2001, and already in 2001, you'll find out it was a myth, the idea that he was a sidekick and that he was carried by Shaq. Because in 2001, this is the year where they are arguably equals in the team. This is where the narrative no longer works. Now, sure, in terms of raw impact, when you look at the position and what you could do in the NBA at the time, yes, Shaq was a very, very dominant player. But actually the numbers aren't as ridiculous as they were the past seasons. In the regular season, Kobe averaged 28.5 points per game. Shaq averaged 28.7. So Shaq's inside, he's only scoring 0.2 points per game extra. So it's very, very close. In the playoffs, they both elevate the numbers. Kobe goes up to 29.4 points per game. Shaq, 30.4 points per game. But here's the thing. We all know Shaq dominated all the finals. And this was another finals he did fantastic in against the Sixers. So how does Shaq end up with 1 point per game better in the playoffs? Well, you must know the answer, right? Shaq was a monster in the finals, but in the rest of the playoffs, Kobe was fantastic. Kobe was dominant in the playoffs. He was a very strong player. And remember, 2001, when the Lakers went 15-1, this is arguably the most dominant run, I mean, statistically it is, of all time in the NBA. This is, some people will put this up there as one of the best, if not the best team ever, and an insane team once you got to the playoffs. Admittedly, they had some problems when Kobe was injured, and the latter part of the season they'd had to make a sick run to get in. But you look at the teams they played. Right, yes, Shaq was the best in the first round against the Trailblazers, who at this point were really fading because Pippen had really gone off his game. And they had all the problems with the Jailblazers line where they were having all the off-the-court issues. And then you go over to the finals against the Sixers, team who could not handle Shaq at all. And also, didn't have a great shooting series. And yes, he's the best player there. So at the beginning and the end of the playoffs, Shaq was the best player. But the part that people forget is you go to the Sacramento Kings series, which was the second round. And people forget because even though the Sacramento Kings the year before took them to 5 games and the next year took them to 7 games, this year's the one where people forget about the Kings completely and they think, oh, they were just an also run. No, they were a very good team. They had 55 wins that season. They were one of the best teams in the NBA. And in this series, Kobe had a strong series overall. Shaq took care of a couple of games. He took care of a couple of games. But particularly Game 4 was one of the best games of his career. He had 48 points and something like ridiculous. I think it was like 18 rebounds or something. Despite trying circumstances where his wife was in the hospital, and he just went completely ham, and he dominated that last game to make it a sweep. Because remember, they swept all the way to the finals, and they lost game 1 of the finals where AI had like the 48 points or whatever it was. Now, you go to the next series, the Western Conference Final, and they play the Spurs. Now, because they sweep this series, people look back as though that was no big deal. You have to understand, the Spurs were the best team in the NBA. They won 58 games in the regular season. They were, if you look at the conference they played in, the Western Conference was the most stacked, and they were the best Western Conference team in the defensive stats. They were a team that was the best three-point shooting team, so they could outscore you. They held you under a certain amount of points. They had 2 players who were all defensive that season. They had Tim Duncan was all defensive first team. They had Bruce Bowen was all defensive second team. They had an MVP level player in Tim Duncan. But at the same time, David Robinson, who was coming towards the end of his career, the next season would be his last season when they won the title. No, 2 seasons from that, 2003. But he was still an All-NBA player. He was voted to the All-NBA third team, so he was still a strong player. They had a deep team that year. And the player everyone forgets, but he ended up being pivotal in the series, was the second or third best player on this team, actually, was a player called Derek Anderson. And this was his prime. He averaged 15.5 points per game. He was almost averaging 40 points from the three-point line. He averaged 39.9%. And remember, they were the best three-point shooting team, so they relied on him for his three-point shooting. Now, admittedly, in this finals, he shit the bed completely. He had a really poor series. He was one of the reasons why they weren't very good. But Kobe was the reason why that team didn't have any chance. Because yes, Shaq was good. Kobe set him up very well. But Kobe's series overall was unbelievable. The assists, the pretty good rebounding, fantastic scoring at times, amazing party piece shots. The one that stands out the most is obviously game one, because remember, these are two great all-defensive players in David Robinson, the Admiral, and Tim Duncan. And Kobe just goes at these guys. Remember, he's a slasher at this point in time. He's not just shooting threes all day long. And game one, he makes like 19 field goals and has 45 points. And this is just a godlike performance. The whole series is incredible. The whole team, the Lakers, is ball out of control. And Kobe's the one finding Derek Fisher, setting up Shaq, scoring himself, doing everything. And he just demolishes them. He was the best player in that series against the best team they played in the playoffs that year. That's the key detail to understand. Now, they got to the finals against the Sixers, and Allen Iverson's Sixers had made perhaps in something of a surprise. You look at some of the close games they'd had, they weren't really a great team. They weren't really a team that should have won the finals. The Spurs or the Lakers would have beaten them that year, and obviously the Lakers did beat them 4-1. Now, in the finals, Kobe was underwhelming. Shaq was incredible, but Kobe really shot himself out of a bunch of the games. He was outclassed by Iverson, because Iverson obviously is a guard as well, and Iverson was having a big performance that playoff run and that finals. And Shaq was just dominant against Dikembe Mutombo and all the players, all the kind of grinding players of the Sixers, and they could do fuck all against him. So yes, the season ended with you just remembering Shaq dominating completely and Kobe doing quite poorly, actually, in a rivalry against his home team, remember, the Sixers, the Philadelphia 76ers, that's where he's obviously from. But for the playoff run as a whole, he was the MVP of the hardest series. He had very good performances against the two best teams they played in the NBA that season in the playoffs, which were the Kings, which were the Spurs. And he, despite his failures in the finals, he ended with only 1 point per game less than Shaq over the playoff run. Now we go to 2002. Now in 2002, this is what you never hear anyone tell you. Kobe was the best player on the Lakers in 2002, and they won the title that year. Now, in the season, regular season, he was 5th in MVP voting. In the regular season, he averaged 25.2 points per game. Shaq averaged 27.2. In the playoffs, he averaged 26.6. Shaq averaged 28.5. So Shaq's less than 2 points per game ahead of him. Now, and that's with, we know again, a monster playoff series, final series for Shaq. So the key detail here is, again, Shaq starts out the season, the playoff run, as the best player. He wins the Portland series for them. He was always doing well against Portland. Now you come, though, to the series in the semis against the Spurs. And again, the Spurs are a very strong team. The best team in the league was obviously the Kings, who had the best record. They had like 61 wins. But the Lakers and the Spurs both had 58 wins. And there were two very strong teams again and again. The Spurs had David Robinson. They had Tim Duncan, the MVP. They were an extremely strong team. In this series against the Spurs, arguably the best team the Lakers played through some of their runs, Kobe was godlike. This time it was an all-round game again, but this time without Shaq doing well, without the rest of the Lakers doing so well, and he was still playing incredibly well. I mean, this is the year when he was transitioning from like the young thin slasher to the 2003 put on the bulk, like already ready to be a prime hard carry. 2002, he was like halfway between in terms of his body and he was adapting his game. 2002 was more of a controlled year. 2001 was like wild scoring, but still coming into his own. 2003 was like way the other end. He went too much volume, arguably. 2002 was the sweet spot, and his efficiency was what made him a killer, and especially in this series against the Spurs. Because in this particular game, this was the one where he was doing well for the whole series. The Lakers won 4-1. In game 3, he had the godlike closeout, which wins the Lakers the game. He had a really strong game overall, but then the fourth quarter, he makes all 5 of his shots. He only takes 5 shots, but he makes all 5 and just closes the game out beautifully. Even Greg Popovich was like overflowing with praise. Game 4 was one where he didn't have a good game in terms of shooting, but the Lakers are dying towards the end of the game. He makes a couple of big shots, including the putback game winner, wins them the game. They then go over to game 5, and he just plays a very efficient game, controls the game, and they close the Spurs out 4-1 in a series that should have been at least 6 or 7 games. And actually, when you looked at how the Lakers were playing for the first few games, you would have said the Spurs probably were the better team at that point in time, actually. Then we come to the conference finals, where they play the Kings. And yes, there was some fuckery with some of the free throws in game 6 and game 7. I certainly think in that sense, if I had to say who should have won, which is obviously a very contentious thing, yeah, I think the Kings probably should have won this series. But first of all, game one, which the Lakers win, Kobe was fantastic in this game, very strong player. He had some difficult games across the second, third, and fourth games. Shaq had his own issues, fouled out of some games, had some issues in terms of defensively, how they were calling him, etc. Obviously strong towards the end of the series with Shaq to win the series. This was a tough one. It was a real war, this one. No one was doing that fantastically in it. And Kobe did miss some like game-winning chances in this one because there was all the eyes on him. Then you get to the final, and actually this is the finals that really gets swept under the rug. People look at the 2000s final where he only had the one really good game, and the 2001 finals where he didn't really have any strong games, and they make out like, oh, all the finals, because Shaq was the finals MVP for all three, even in 2002, it was just all Shaq and Kobe did fuck all. What they forget is there are two games here that are worth pointing out. Game two, Kobe's really efficient. He makes like 9 out of 15 shots. Yeah, Shaq's still the best player, but it's a really, really solid contribution. And game three, Kobe's the best player. In fact, game three was one of the masterpieces of Kobe's career in the context of how important it was in the finals, and arguably the best game he ever had in a finals. He had a really, really big game. He scored in all different kind of ways on difficult shots. No matter what the defense was giving him, he was able to take advantage. He even makes the key game winner towards the end of the game. And he's so smooth. You can already see the complete package in terms of game. So yes, Shaq dominates the finals. By the way, the Nets had nothing for Shaq that season. They had no chance to be able to compete with him, and arguably they were the worst of the teams that the Lakers played in the finals. But remember, there's two more finals where Kobe and Shaq play together. So if we're going to make this idea that he was carried by Shaq, let's look at those two seasons as well, shall we? I've already shown you how for two of the seasons he wasn't carried. He was sharing it in 2001 and 2002. He was the best player, but no one counts that ring towards him. But let's look at the other two seasons they played together. So 2003 was the one where famously, after winning the title in 2002, Shaq just basically doesn't rehab himself over the summer with an injured toe, waits, has surgery, misses a bunch of games, and so Kobe, just to keep the Lakers competitive, has to go on this mental streak. I mean, not all these games are without Shaq, where he has 9 straight games of 40 points or more, and this is a godlike streak, one of the best scoring streaks you will ever see in NBA history, and that's just to get the Lakers a chance to get somewhere decent. I think they ended with the 5th seed in the end because they played the Timberwolves, Garnett's team, in the first round. So already he's the best player by far on the Lakers at this point in time. Shaq never comes back quite as dominant again. He goes against the Wolves in the first round. Wolves are the highest seed. They have Kevin Garnett, who's obviously already a very good player, MVP level player, and he dominates. He's the best player in the series. He's having all the clutch shots, all the difficult shots. He's already getting close to transitioning to the hard carry Kobe of later years post Shaq. Now, when they get to play the Spurs in the semi-finals, this is the time when the Spurs get them. But the problem is, he has a couple of good games here, in spite of all the problems. Because at this point in time, realistically, the Lakers were done. Like, the whole Kobe Shaq thing wasn't working. They had the team already wasn't deep enough, actually. They only had those two stars, basically. When you're going against teams like the Spurs at this point in time, you can't fuck with that. And so Robert Horry famously missed like every three-pointer except one or something mental during that whole playoff run. Phil Jackson literally had to leave at least one game. I think he got kicked out of a game, I think he might have got kicked out of a game, and then one game he had to leave because he had like a heart operation to have or something mental. He might even have missed 2 games because of that, and they won one of them. So they had to use like an assistant coach at that point in time. So a lot of problems there beyond just Kobe. Yes, he was at that point in time really testing the limits, so he did shoot them out of like 1 or 2 of the games. But that's how the season ends. 2004, now in this scenario, there's the whole rape allegations against him. He's having to fly to Denver, Colorado all the time for the case. Even so, he has a pretty good regular season. Not fantastic, not as good as the past years. In the playoffs, he's still good. He's the best player in the playoffs overall. He's certainly the best player once you play the Spurs again, which is a key matchup. They should have lost to the Spurs on paper. It was hit Kobe and Derek Fisher's ridiculous 0.4-second shot that basically got them to the Western Conference Finals. And when they got to the finals, I will say this finals was very disappointing. He has the one good game in game 2 where he's really, really good. But the other games, he's shit. He shoots them out of it completely. And even worse, he shoots them out of it while actually 2 of the games, he absolutely should have fed Shaq as much as he could. At least given him 3 or 4 more shots. Because in game 1 and game 4, Shaq was incredible, was making a really high percentage of his shots, was dominating, and they didn't feed him the ball enough. He didn't get enough shots, and the Lakers lost both of them, and Kobe had terrible shooting performances in both. Now, yes, the way that the Pistons touched him up and really put pressure on him and had long players like Prince covering him, and then had the fast, well-conditioned players like Richard Hamilton, who we had to run about after all the time. And then there was the whole issue with him and Shaq, and then him and Phil Jackson, and him going outside of the system. Yeah, there was all sorts of clusterfuck stuff. But in that finals, yes, Shaq played well, but he wasn't like the dominant player of both teams. Kobe had one good game and did fuck it up in that one. But the point is, overall, those last couple of years, Kobe's the best player on the Lakers by far. So here's the problem. The factors which go in favour and make it seem, without looking at the other context, that it could be the case that Shaq was just carrying them completely. Well, let's look at this. The first 4 seasons they played together, Shaq was an MVP level player, while Kobe started as a rookie, then became a sidekick. Now, Shaq was the finals MVP in all 3 periods. Kobe wasn't that good in finals, especially prior to 2008 when he went back with the Lakers. Shaq's impact was bigger. Whether the numbers were similar, Shaq's impact was bigger, and thus he was more valuable in many ways. There wasn't any all-star centers of his level. Obviously, Tim Duncan technically played center, but should be a power forward. And it's a way to put Kobe down in contrast to Michael Jordan, LeBron, etc. And finally, as a final factor as to why people want to believe this, let's face it, Lakers fans, especially the die-hard Lakers fans, are fucking annoying and overrate Kobe ridiculously. Now, to counter all of those factors, okay, when I said for the first 4 seasons, Shaq was the MVP, Kobe was a rookie, then sidekick, okay, well, after that, there was 2 seasons where all things considered, they were even. They were kind of like 1A, 1B options, both extremely good and both top 5 players in the NBA. Then the last 2 seasons they played together, Kobe was the man on the Lakers. He was the best player. Now, in terms of Shaq being the finals MVP, Shaq's position was weaker relative to his peer group in the NBA than Kobe's was. There were tons of sick guards, sick perimeter players in the NBA, and especially once you got to the finals, once you got out of the Western Conference, which is where a lot of the good big men were, and obviously Tim Duncan is the primary big man, and Kevin Garnett is the other big man that you really look at in the NBA at that point in time. Eastern Conference didn't have anything that they could put up at that point in time. They didn't have any star centers that could go against Shaq. So when you get to the finals, Shaq should be the one dominating his position and winning you the game off it. Whereas you look at the other players that play in the finals, okay, old Reggie Miller, but pretty good Jalen Rose still. You have AI the next year. You have Jason Kidd, obviously. The good players are at the guard position in the finals, whereas actually the center position, they can't outplay Shaq in that sense. Dikembe Mutombo was already old as fuck. I don't know how much that guy lied on his birth certificate. He's a very good player still, but he couldn't defend Shaq, no matter how good he was that year. Then you've got to consider, okay, so Kobe wasn't that good in finals, but here's the counter to that. He was godlike in conference finals. He was the player where you have to win the conference finals to get to the finals. So 2 of the conference finals went to game 7s. The other one, they were outmatched against the Spurs team that he helped control and defeat. So you look at that overall, he was the MVP in some ways of the conference finals they played, while Shaq was the MVP of the finals. Well, what's the problem with that? They played the toughest teams in the conference finals. They played the Trailblazers, they played the Spurs, they played the Kings. The finals opponents were much weaker than that. The Pacers, the Sixers, the Nets, these weren't super good teams. They were good in the East, and the East was famous. This is one of the worst periods ever for the East after Jordan's Bulls had gone. It was really whack. The Eastern Conference Finals games used to be fucking terrible those years. Those Western teams would all have won the title if the Lakers hadn't. The Portland Trailblazers would have murdered the Sixers, 5 or 6 games at most. The Spurs would have killed the Sixers, the Pacers rather in 2000. The Spurs would have killed the Sixers, and the Spurs or the, let me think, would it be in the Spurs? The Spurs or the Kings, probably the Kings, would have absolutely destroyed the Nets. That would have been 100% a win. So the Western Conference Finals was harder than the finals. Now, it wasn't as much as there's not as much pressure on your mind, and that's why I think Kobe didn't play as well. Now let's look at the other factors. So when you look at the fact that it's a way to put him down in contrast to a Michael Jordan or something, well, that one needs its own separate video because they're playing totally different eras. Even the defensive rules are different in their eras, so you can't judge them the same way. It doesn't work that way. So you can ignore that one. That's just a moot point. And then finally, the one about the Lakers fans being annoying and overrating Kobe. Yeah, I agree, but that doesn't mean you should skew and be unfair and have double standards towards Kobe Bryant that you don't have towards other players. So really, the issue here is that it's such a unique case. We never really had a case like this ever. I mean, the closest you could ever get is like Kareem and Magic, and even then they had the perfect overlap for when one was the carrier and one was like the up-and-coming star. They were far enough apart that it wasn't an issue. Kobe and Shaq were too close together, and so they were still vying with each other when the transition period should naturally have happened otherwise, and so it didn't. And obviously it had a personality difference that the other two didn't. So this is one of the toughest cases to ever judge in terms of who gets the credit here, because from 2001 onwards, they legitimately are the 1A and 1B options. They're not the number one and the number two option. It doesn't work that way. Depends what team you're playing, depends what matchup you've got, and depends who's having the better game as to who the number one player in that team was. I mean, when your second best player, as people would say in this narrative, is averaging 25 to 28 points a game. That's not like a normal sidekick. That's not like a normal second best player. That's a star player in their own right, an NBA, all NBA player in their own right, as we also saw. They also played different roles. Obviously, one was an inside player, one was an outside player. If you can put it inside, that's the way to get easier 2-point baskets. Shaq shoots a higher percentage, obviously, but you still need the outside game to keep people honest. You still need the outside game for when you can't get it inside to Shaq, when you've got good defensive teams like the Spurs, like the Kings, etc. out there. They obviously had very different defensive roles. Yes, Shaq used to get good rebound numbers and used to get good numbers of blocks overall for someone his size, but Kobe was the better defender. They also played so well together that they played off each other very well, so you can't judge them in isolation. And obviously later in his career, I mean at the end of his Lakers career, but definitely later after Shaq, Kobe went on to be a hard carry, primary option, alpha male, and the best player in the NBA. So it's very rare there's ever been two players who played together who were both the best in the NBA at different points in time. That's why I picked out the Magic and Kareem example before. And hence, by the way, why people always correctly say if they could have stayed together, I mean, obviously you'd have to figure out the contracts where they both wanted the max contract. Yeah, they should have been able to transition into the era where Kobe's the star player and Shaq's the sidekick, and they continue winning titles, and they get, what, 6, 7 titles would have been a possibility. So when you start breaking it down, if we're going to be reasonable, how do we break it up? If you have to be the clear alpha of your team to win a title, don't they each get 1.5 titles then? I mean, in 2000, Shaq's the clear alpha. 2001, they're both like equal, so we give them each 0.5. And then in 2002, it's Kobe. So do they get 1.5 titles each? Because in that case, we would end up with Kobe on 3.5 titles. Now, that doesn't sound wrong, actually. If you think about his career, you think about the type of player he was, 3.5 titles is very good. And that sounds about right for where you'd rank him in history, really. The problem is it's the Shaq one, because people don't believe, if we're going to go with this whole thing that you have to be the clear alpha in your team to compare to Michael Jordan and all these guys, then Shaq is the one that gets screwed because he only has 2 titles. Now, you might think, well, what do you mean? Well, he gets the 1.5 for the Kobe era, and then he gets 0.5 for being the co-star along with Dwayne Wade in 2006 when they won the title. Now, you might think to yourself, oh, no, actually, if you want to be harsh, you could say Dwayne Wade deserved that one. No, because that's the same thing people do about Shaq, but in reverse, because Shaq was incredibly good in conference finals and right up to the final. He just had a bad finals. And Dwayne Wade, conversely, was good, but could be streaky in the rest of the playoffs. And in 2006 had a godlike finals. And yes, the refs were bullshit in that finals, but he was still very good. So actually, Shaq should get a 0.5 for that. And so you put that together, Shaq now only has 2 titles. Now that's the one that's off, isn't it? It doesn't sound right to say Shaq only has 2 titles. He was very good in 4 seasons. But at the same time, if you're going to be harsh and judge it that way, you've got to take some of those away from him because people want to take them away from Kobe otherwise. So the point I'm trying to make is it doesn't really work that way. It's too difficult. So I also don't understand why this double standard is only applied to Kobe Bryant. That's why it's a double standard. LeBron is now, some people are calling him better than Michael Jordan, top 3 player, top 2 player of all time, making it out like you're delusional if you don't think so. But he's allowed to win all his titles with a super stacked Heat team. Some of those latter Heat teams were a fucking joke in terms of how they abused the veterans minimum. Like fucking former All-Stars just all the way down the bench. Then you go to the Cavs, who have like ridiculous scoring output and 3-point shooting, and like third best player can average like 24 points or whatever it is a game. So very deep teams with other All-Star players. But LeBron gets to count those titles as though he was like the Michael Jordan, right? Just carry the whole team. Magic Johnson won 5 titles. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar won 6 titles. They played with each other for 5 of those titles. Made it to the finals like 8 times together or something. This is ridiculous. Kareem was an MVP of the league at one point in time. Magic was an MVP of the league at the end of his career. How do we divide up those titles, boys? Does one of them get 2 titles? Does one of them get 5 titles? How does it work? People never bother to stop when it's those great players and break it down the way. Now, I understand it's because no one's comparing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in general. No one does it. They should to Michael Jordan and saying, right, what's the contrasting points here? Point is, it's hypocrisy, though. So as you can see, if you actually watch the games and you break it down, well, again, that's unfair, isn't it? You could watch the games and not think this. But when I watched the games and I broke it down this way and I studied these guys over their careers, looked at their different roles, I have to look at it and say, yes, Shaq carried Kobe at times, but they were both incredibly good players and they both deserve a lot of the credit. And even in terms of the alpha argument, you've got to count it that way. So, for example, when I said as a final point that Shaq had the more impact, okay, in certain areas of the game. So Shaq was a liability in free throws. So late in a game, it's tough to have Shaq getting fouled. He's going to make 1 out of 2 roughly. Well, I'm slightly over that, but roughly 1 out of 2. He fouls out of games. Now you don't have a star player. Kobe was always the closer on those teams. Shaq also can't create a shot in the same way. Kobe got him the ball. He was the primary ball handler. And Kobe's style of slashing opens up Shaq to get shots. Just as Shaq playing as this dominant inside presence that people have to double team also allows Kobe open shots. So they both played off each other in that sense. Then you've got to add in that from the 2002 season on, they brought in zone defense. So it's now possible to play better defense on Kobe than it is on Shaq. You can now play him zone, which is one of the reasons why the rest of his career can't be contrasted against Michael Jordan's. Also, one thing that kills me about the NBA is people to this day still look at the offensive side, and that's how they judge players. They don't look and say, who are the two-way players in this game? I mean, admittedly, this is one thing I've always loved about hockey. They venerate the great two-way players, and they should. But in basketball, people still make it like you're either a defensive player or an offensive player. No, the great players, in most cases, are two-way players, unless they were really extremely good just offensively. And Kobe was a great two-way player. Now, Shaq wasn't. He was good at blocks, he was a huge guy, and he could be a presence, but he wasn't a monster. Kobe was on the All-NBA defensive team for 5 of the 8 seasons he played with Shaq, and made the first team 3 times during that time period. Now, over those 5 times where Kobe was on the All-NBA defensive team, Shaq made it 3 times, and all of them were second team, never on the first team. So Kobe was the better defender of the two. What is the no defensive side to the game now? Remember, in the playoffs, it's harder to score points generally, even though these guys all elevated their numbers. So being able to shut people down becomes more valuable than in the regular season. So, yeah, my problem is there is some truth to where the myth comes from. Like, there's an element of the myth that's reasonable. The overall narrative is ridiculous and skews history. And people, as a result, give one person too much credit and one person not enough.